All right, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I hope I am coming in just fine. I think I am. I want to thank you for being here tonight. You know, there's a lot of other things you could be doing besides just listening to me tell you how this guy lived his life. So it means a lot to me. I appreciate that. And I'm going to just kind of get started because I don't really have anyone in the studio here as a guest. So I'm going to just kind of start out and just do my thing here, and then if people see the StreamYard link and they want to join, then I'll let them. But I'm not going to make this like an open audience thing until like I'm done reading all of the passages. For now, if you're someone that I know and I trust you, you're free to join, but I'm not just going to let random people on, at least right now. Maybe later if you guys can behave yourselves, but that's a big what if. So this is a pretty decent book. It's called The New World of Martin Cortés. It's by Anna Lanyon. She's an Australian historian who mastered the Spanish and Portuguese language, and she made this book from scratch using all primary sources that she managed to find, in Spain and in Mexico, which is impressive. I mean, why is it that she's the one that has to do something like this? She's an Anglo woman, for God's sake, from Australia. And I'm sure plenty of this stuff already exists in Spanish, but in terms of like the first person to do this in English, I would say she's definitely one of the first people to do it. So, and Anna actually has a book that's more famous than Martin, the one about Martin Cortés. She's also the author of Malinche's Conquest, which was actually a much more successful and popular book. It actually was used as the plotline for a movie, I think, in the early 2000s that they made in Mexico about the conquest of Mexico. So, yeah, without further ado, let us begin. So one of the first things I noticed in the preface here is that you can actually tell she's very nuanced on like how the actual Spanish language works, and she doesn't just try to project, like Australian Anglo-Saxon like sociological race and ethnic relations onto the Spanish world. Like she gets it's different. So what do I mean? So this is a good quote right here. It says, "One comment on the language. The Spanish word mestizo is often translated into English as half-caste or half-breed. Yet at a deep semantic level, mestizo is very different from those terms. It does not share their connotations of something halved or diminished or lessened. Mestizo is derived from the Latin miscere, to mix or fuse or blend. And that is all it means, mixed. In Mexico today, where the majority of people are descended from both Amerindian and Spanish ancestors, mestizo is not an offensive word, but a symbol of the epic marriage, as the writer Richard Rodriguez calls the Spanish conquest, out of which Martin Cortés and modern Mexico were born." So yeah, she totally gets it right off the bat. I did notice that's a big thing that like a lot of people, they try to project on the Spanish Empire, which isn't true. And that's the problem with language, right? I mean, I'm glad that I'm good at English, but there's a certain way of being able to think and express yourself that you can only do in Latin languages that you can't do in English, in my opinion, at least. Which is why it's important to master Spanish as we get older. So I'm going to start with this passage here. Because there's a lot to unpack, obviously, right? Death in war, death by the obsidian knife. It was the most honorable fate such a woman could envisage for a male child in her society. But this boy was a child of two worlds. Whatever prayers his Aztec nurse may have uttered in her own Nahuatl language, whatever secret name his mother might have given him in the hours following his birth, his father's world was also waiting to claim him. Therefore, sometime later that day or night, one of the 4 European priests in Mexico at the time entered the room to perform the ritual of Christian baptism. And then it says here, did Cortés cradle his son in his arms during the ceremony or hand him to the godfather he must have appointed for him? These details about the earliest moments of Martin's life were not recorded. We know only that the officiating priest blessed the child in Latin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and while pouring holy water over his small head, baptized him with the name of his father had chosen for him. Martin, which was in memory of the Roman god of war. Martin, in memory of the soldier saint. Martin de Tours. Martin, in honor of Hernan Cortés's own beloved father in Spain. It was the most precious name he could imagine for his firstborn son. Yeah. So now we're on to the next section here that I'm going to read. So it's kind of talking about how Martin probably did not remember his own mother. So here it is. Few of us have memories of our earliest years, and as I followed his trail through life, I found no overt expressions of loss and longing among his papers, and nothing to suggest that, as an adult, he remembered anything of his mother, La Malinche. But absence of conscious memory does not mean that in the years that followed the separation, he did not yearn for her warmth, her smell, for the Natual or Mayan words she must have murmured to him from the day he was born. It was September 1526 by the time Malinche returned to Mexico Tenochtitlan with her new Spanish husband and her infant daughter. For the next 3 years, she lived in an elegant house 3 blocks north of the city's central plaza while her son, who was now 4 years old, apparently remained in the Altamirano house 3 blocks south of the plaza. The physical distance between them was slight, therefore, so slight that it is possible they glimpsed each other from time to time in the great square that lay beneath them. And then there's another thing we have to talk about here, which actually makes the book a lot more complex and made this job a lot harder for the author, which I'm impressed at the work she did, and you're going to find out why here. So basically, what made this hard for her was the fact that there were 3 Martin Corteses. Only one was a Mestizo. So let me read this chapter here. It says he also took, so they're kind of talking about how at around like the age of 6, when Martin's 6, Cortés decides to bring his son to Spain. So it says here, he took with him 3 of the Aztec emperor's sons, whom he intended to present at the royal court of Spain. One of them was known as Martin Cortés Nezahualcóyotl, because Cortés had honored him as well as his father's name. So 2 passengers called Martin Cortés set sail for Spain that March of 1528. One, an Aztec prince. The other, a small mestizo boy. There is something, let me see here. So yeah, that's kind of what we got there. Then, what I think a lot of people don't know is Martin spends a giant chunk of his life in Spain. Like, we're talking almost his entire childhood, and I'd say the majority of his adulthood. He wasn't like a child that grew up in Mexico, which is unique about him. And another thing that I found interesting here is the fact that she actually went out of her way to sort of talk about how the conquistadors compared themselves to Romans and how they ultimately saw themselves as inheritors of Rome. So I'm going to read this and you can make your own judgments for yourself. It was from this much conquered province that the first conquistadors set out for the Americas. Cortés, Pizarro, Soto, Alvarado, Balboa, Almagro, all those names that have resonated down through the centuries. To be an extremeño, a man from Extremadura, was sufficient to ensure inclusion in the great early expeditions of Spanish conquest when men defined themselves by their kinship, their province, and their fate. When the idea of nationality had barely begun to form in their minds. So it's important to understand for the audience here, this idea of nationalism, of ethno-states, nation states, this is entirely foreign to the subject of the Holy Roman Emperor, or Empire. They're aware of their own ethnicity. It's not like they don't have an ethnos that they're aware of. It's just like, it's not the end all be all, and the idea of making a state where it's only people of your ethnicity, like an ethno state, it would have never crossed these people's minds because this was prior to liberalism. And nationalism was something that came out of liberalism. It's impossible to separate the two. They are one and the same, especially in the context of Latin America. So continuing on here, it says, the extremeños were young. Cortés had been 19 when he left for Cuba. Pizarro and Almagro were even younger. They were physically strong and driven by their poverty and a hunger for whatever fortune might offer them. They had grown up among the Roman ruins of their province and seemed always deeply conscious of its influence. Bernal Diaz de Castillo recalled that Cortés liked to invoke the deeds of Julius Caesar as he urged his frequently mutinous men to remain steadfast in the face of the uncertainties and the peril they faced every day in Mexico. His grand illusions seemed to work. And then it says here, Cortés went on to develop some comparisons with the heroic deeds of the Romans, Diaz de Castillo said after one rebellious incident. And we all answered to a man that we would obey his orders, and that the die was cast for good fortune, as Caesar said at the Rubicon. When the men from Extremadura reached the far side of the Atlantic, they scattered the old Roman names of their province across the face of the Americas, so that a Mayan town in southern Mexico received the name Merida in memory of the Emperor Augustus Emerida, while other towns and cities were named Medellin for a Roman consul called Metellus, who had lived 70 years before Christ. The original Medellin, in eastern Extremadura, is the place where Hernan Cortés was born. It is a small and pretty village beside the serene waters of the Guadiana River, close to Portugal, and very far removed from its geography and its milieu from the dangerous streets of its Colombian namesake. And yeah, Medellin today, I believe, is a town, I think, of like 2,000 people in Spain. It's not very populated. And if it's not very populated now, I imagine it was probably even less populated back then. So we have the next passage here where it says, it's kind of talking about Hernan Cortés after the conquest. They've made it to Spain, and now Cortés is requesting an audience from Carlos, or not Carlos, or let me see, from, I believe, King Philip. So it says here, Lopez de Gomara said that Carlos V received his errant conquistador, who was 15 years his senior, with great affection. Bernal Diaz de Castillo went a little further in his own account of the meeting. He said the emperor took Cortés's hands, raised him from his knees, and led him to a seat of honor beside him. As always with Diaz de Castillo, we hear the resonance of an Old Testament story, or an echo of one of the romances of chivalry he loved to read, and sense that allegory may be at the work in his telling of things. But it is true that despite those years of tension and suspicion, the emperor seems to have forgiven Cortés and his transgressions when he came before him in 1528. He even created a new aristocratic title for him, the Marqués de Valle de Oaxaca, a title abbreviated ever after to the Marqués de Valle, since Oaxaca, a Zapotec word from southern Mexico, was as daunting to 16th century Spaniards as it is to English speakers now. And yeah, I just want to read some comments real quickly. If this was written by an Anglo, it's going to be biased. It is. I mean, all books have their bias, but based on every account I can see, she actually seems to be very much a Hispanophile, as Rancho is saying in the chat here. And Rancho, you're free to come on if you'd like at any time. But yeah, she is a huge, huge fan of the Hispanic world. And she even goes out of her way in later chapters to sort of highlight how she believes the Spanish crown was a lot more fair to the Indians of Mexico compared to how the Australian Aborigines were treated by the Anglo settlers. But we're not going to get that till very close to the end here. So yeah, basically, Hernan Cortés did a lot of shady things during the conquest, or not shady, maybe shady is the wrong word, but he was doing things that were very rebellious against the governor of Cuba, I believe, Velázquez was his name. And, he basically, we can go into the conquest of Mexico in another day, but essentially what's important here to understand is, this is a situation where, how do we put it? It's like he bet the entire farm and he won. But had he lost, he would have been extremely fucked by the entire Spanish crown. Because, I mean, he wasn't supposed to go against Velázquez, but he did. So now we're on to the next section here. So now this is talking about sort of Martin again. So this is going on to talk about how he actually would become a page for the emperor. So it says Bernal Diaz de Castillo said that during the conquest, Malinche had become close to a boy called Juan de Ortega, who was a page to Cortés. She had taught this boy the Aztec language, Nahuatl, and his proficiency was such, Diaz de Castillo said, that the emperor, Moctezuma, liked to talk with him. I wondered whether Malinche had understood when her son left for Spain that he too might become a page. So for the audience, so you understand, a page is like a royal servant of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, right? This is something that like you have to be of royalty to even be considered to do. And this was something that Martin Cortés, the Mestizo son of Hernan Cortés, did. So it says here, at the royal court, Martin Cortés was not exposed to the terrors of the conquest. A Juan de Ortega had been. Martin would have slept in vast dormitories with all those other boys from noble families who were his fellow pages, and eaten with them at long refectory tables in palaces and castles in Valladolid, in Barcelona, in Toledo, and Madrid. Like them, he would have dressed in fine clothes and received rigorous instruction in Latin and Spanish beneath the watchful eye of the master of pages. He is certain to have heard the famous court preacher Antonio de Guevara read from his popular Golden Book of Marcus Aurelius, which examined the Stoic ideals of the great philosopher emperor in 700 pages of highly ornate language. And Martin would have learned the art of sword fighting, the importance of self-discipline, and skills required for the warrior's life he would have to lead. And yeah, basically, I picked out this passage here because it's highlighting that Martin was treated like Spanish royalty, he was not treated differently because he was a mestizo in terms of like what he was able to do in Spain and what he wasn't. Now, it is important to highlight, however, though, that at this point in the Spanish Empire, I don't think most Spaniards would have ever seen a mestizo. Like it just wasn't the case. It was very early on, being the son of Hernan Cortés, and he was probably just viewed as this kind of oddity. I think if you go to Spain today, these people have all seen mestizos all the time. It wasn't like that back then. So it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't have been the only racially mixed person in Spain that was important. I mean, there was mixing with, people like the Jews and the Moors. But yeah, they probably, it's hard to say how they would have actually seen him back then. All right, let's continue on. It says, so this is talking about Carlos V and Hernan Cortés's tensions that would eventually start to rise and would actually come to really bite Martin Cortés in the ass later. So here's what I mean. It says, after their admissible first meeting late in 1528, Carlos V returned to Hernan Cortés the estates the crown had confiscated while he was in Honduras. Carlos also granted Cortés perpetual rights to them. In a rare concession, he gave to only one other person, Isabel Moctezuma, the daughter of the Aztec emperor. All the other conquistadors in Mexico, except Cortés, will be forced to surrender their estates after 2 generations. For Carlos, like his grandparents Isabella and Ferdinand, was determined to prevent the rise of a hereditary feudal nobility. His resolve caused a bitter division in conquistador society, one in which Malinche's child would be drawn on his return to Mexico. But that was not for some years yet. In the meantime, the emperor continued to treat Hernan Cortés handsomely. He refused to make him the viceroy of the land he had conquered, however. It was the thing Cortés desired above all else. It was the thing Cortés but Carlos reserved that critical role for a trusted member of the aristocratic Mendoza family. So yeah, This is going to blow up a lot later, and it's going to backfire specifically on the two Martin Cortezes, who are both also Hernan Cortez's son, which again creates a lot of confusion that they have to go through and decipher in this book. So here's another passage that I found was important as well. It's that Martin Cortés, in order to be admitted into this, I guess, academy that he got, which I believe is called the Order of Santiago, he needed testimony from four respected like Spanish men in order to be considered in. So Martin actually had four conquistadors who were there with Hernan, basically saying that, yeah, he is, high quality kid, high quality parents of great worth, the Malinche and Hernan. And they said, yeah, they testified in front of everybody there saying, let him in. And Martin was definitely, he was watching all of this. He could see them doing their testimonies. And I believe his father was the one who would have to carefully choose these people. So now we got a comment here. It says from Chivo, it says, how many chapters are you going to read? I'm not reading any entire chapters. This is a book review. I'm just picking the most important passages from the book, expanding on them, and then moving on. And yeah, if anyone from like Pocho Hour wants to join me or whatever, they're free to, but nobody's clicked on the StreamYard link yet. They're probably just busy. So we have another passage here. It says, aspirants to the order were obliged to attend their hearings, so Martin Cortés must have sat through the proceedings in Toledo, a small figure listening silently as his father's friends confirmed that he was a boy of virtuous nature and sound mental capacity, and that the Amerindian mother he did not know was a principled Indian of good character and standing. The master and the prior of the order listened too, and it seems they found the child satisfactory on all accounts because they admitted him to their ranks as a knight of the Order of Santiago. So, yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about. And I forgot to emphasize this earlier, but I might as well say it now. Yeah, Martin didn't really know his mother. He was separated from her extremely early, and she was eventually remarried to another Spanish conquistador, I believe. Like, Cortés kind of just married his side chick out. But, it is what it is. And, it's not like he abandoned Martin and was a deadbeat dad. I mean, he brought him to Spain, and you're going to find out the things that he did for his son's honor that I think is very respectable. But we'll get to that when we get to it. So, yeah, we're going to have to go into the intro to Cortés's, Hernan Cortés's second wife for this to be relevant here. It says, the bride's name was Juana Ramirez de Aranyo y Zuniga, but these days she is simply referred as Juana de Zuniga. I had seen a marble bust of her years earlier in the Palace of Mexico, where she and Hernan Cortés went to live. She had looked delicate and pale with her downcast eyes and her pursued lips, yet her fragility must have been an illusion, for she is almost a woman in this story who lives long enough to raise her children to adulthood. She was always described as young when she married Cortés. She may have been anywhere between 16 and 20. Her feelings towards this older stranger to whom her uncle had betrothed her are unknown, but they would have been irrelevant to her destiny. Like all aristocratic European daughters at the time, she lived in the gilded cage, hostage to her family's acquisitive dynastic plans. Women seemed to find Cortés attractive, however. And in this Doña Juana may have been no different from his many lovers in Cuba and Mexico. Bernal Diaz de Castillo said Cortés was excessively fond of women. Francisco López de Gomara agreed that he always gave himself to them. It might that he returned to Spain with a warrior's glamour and a charm that a pampered noblewoman like Juana might have found appealing. And yeah, I want to just read this comment by Rancho here. It says, Order of Santiago is like the Navy SEALs or Green Berets, etc., elite soldiers that would have received an Ivy League level education. Exactly. That's very well put, Rancho. So remember how I was talking about how Cortés would go out of his way to try, restoring his illegitimate son's honor? Well, this is what I mean. So it says here, this is going to be a long passage, but it's important. In fact, let me take a sip of water. It says here, in Spain, I learned that almost everything Hernan Cortés desired for his firstborn son was something that had once been denied to him. Cortés had secured Martin a position as page at the royal court. He had seen him admitted to the Order of Santiago. But there was one more privilege he wanted for him before he returned to Mexico and the lands the emperor had now restored to him. He wanted Martin legitimized. Legitimacy could be granted, or more correctly, purchased by papal decree. Cortés knew this and had already dispatched an attorney to Rome to ensure Martin would not be burdened with the stain of illegitimacy for the rest of his life. The attorney was now on his way back to Spain, carrying a precious papal bull declaring that Martin Cortés, together with another half-brother and half-sister in Mexico, whom he did not yet know, were now legitimate. To our beloved sons, Martin Cortés and Luis de Altamirano, the Pope Clemente had written, and to our beloved daughter, Catalina Pizarro of the Diocese of Mexico, children of our beloved son, Fernando Cortés, good health and apostolic blessing. The Pope assured Martin Cortés and his siblings that the vice of illegitimate birth in no way tarnished their brightness, because the beauty of their virtue would cleanse them of the stain of their birth, while their pure conduct would erase the shame of their origins. He noticed that their father had asked with great humility that his children be legitimized. Therefore he, Clemente, had decided to use his apostolic authority to cleanse them of every mark or stain of illegitimacy and restore to them the ancient rights of legitimate birth. And I declare, he concluded, that you are legitimate, and that in this no other laws, neither imperial nor municipal, take precedence over apostolic law. And then there's another passage which I thought is important. It says the Pope himself actually was an illegitimate child at the time. He had been born Guilo de Medici as a nephew of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He never suffered for his birth. His portrait in the Vatican Museum shows a slender man with black hair, deep brown eyes, and fine, elegant features. Possibly young and probably handsome for a pontiff, he too had an illegitimate child to whom he seems to have deeply attached, a son, Alessandro, whose mother was an African servant girl. The 19-year-old African-Italian Medici was already Duke of Penna. He would soon be Duke of Florence and husband to the daughter of Carlos V, so neither his African blood nor his illegitimacy had disadvantaged him. And yeah, that's just sort of like an example of, people would go, if they had the means to, would legitimize their children if they weren't complete pieces of shit. But unfortunately, that's not every person. But it was Hernan, and I think he deserves credit for that. So we have another interesting thing here, another longish passage, but it's kind of going into the idea of like what sort of internal thoughts did Hernan probably have about his mestizo son? Like what can be deciphered from his private letters, right? Well, we have some, and I'm going to be reading it here. All right, it says here, around the time his half-brother came into the world, the first Martin, Malinche's child, fell ill in Spain. When Cortés learned of his sickness, he wrote again to his cousin in words that still burn with anxiety and indignation. Write your letter of October, he tells Nunez. You sent a note from Diego Perez de Vargas with an account of Don Martin's illness. You said you would go about and see about it and write to me with the truth, but I have seen no letter of yours. You may well believe that the news of his illness caused me pain, and perhaps you didn't wish to write to me about it. He seems to pause here to ensure his meaning is clear, Well, he thunders, I want you to know that I do not love him less than the child of God has given me through the Marquesa, and that I therefore desire to know everything of him, and always. And then here we have the author's commentary. It says here, it is strangely moving to hear the conqueror of Mexico reduced to trembling anguish like this over his child. Strange to hear him lose the careful composure with which he wrote his famous letters to the emperor. Months have passed since he first learned that Martin was ill. Ships have come and gone between Spain and Mexico, but he has heard nothing more. It's obvious he fears his cousin does not understand the depth of his feelings for this child. Has Martin perished? Will nobody tell him the truth? Write to me as quickly as possible about his health, he begs his cousin, because since receiving the account you sent, I have had no relief from my anxiety. It affected me deeply, he continues, that his illness was lamparones. I think that is the greatest falsehood in the world, because the child has a good constitution, and what he must be is bujamiento de sangre, which could have been cured at the beginning by taking him to the country. And it says here, lamparones, diminutive of lampara or lamp. What could little lamps have meant in 16th century medical terms? And bujamiento de sangre, the pushing of blood? Why does Cortés sound so angry about the alleged nature of his son's illness? Well, she goes into detail why. In Spain that spring, I learned that lamparones signified the disease the French and English called the king's evil, because they believed the king could cure it. In Macbeth, the Scottish prince Malcolm describes its sufferers as strangely visited people, all swollen and ulcerous, pitiful to the eye. In modern medical terms, it is known as scrofula, but it is seldom encountered in the Western world these days. It is like a form of tuberculosis that attacks the lymph nodes in the neck, causing abscess and ulceration of the skin. So there was a terrible logic to the expression little lamps to describe the burning ulcers on Martin Cortés's neck. Whereas lamparones was a wretched and disfiguring condition, bujamiento de sangre was a respectable malady. In the medical wisdom of the day, it denoted an excess of one of the essential humors, in this case blood. It was an illness that might be cured by taking the afflicted person to the fresh air of the countryside. These notions of acceptable and unacceptable illness, familiar to us still, must explain Cortés's indignation at his son's diagnosis. He believed his child had been wrongly labeled with an abhorrent disease, and, if that were not enough, he had been deprived of the correct medical treatment for his true condition. Had Martin Cortés been a resident at the royal court of England, his king may have well laid his hands on him in an attempt at cure. But in 1532, the emperor was in Augsburg or Brussels or Piedmont on imperial business as usual, for he was rarely in Spain. Even if Carlos V had been at court that year, Spain's rulers did not claim the healing powers attributed to the English and the French monarchs. So how was Martin Cortés's illness treated? A court surgeon was probably called to lance his ulcerous bulbs, and from that day on, his neck would have shown the scars that such treatment caused. There are other suggestive allusions in this letter of 1532. It says here, apart from the memory I've already sent you, Cortés continues, I have now sent another 500 pesos to the Lord Count of Miranda and entrusted the child to him, so he can handle the matter of the tutor's fees. And then this is like the author's commentary. Is he implying here that Martin's tutor has failed in his duty of care because of some dispute over money? Perhaps, although it is impossible to know for certain without understanding of what is troubling Cortés. But there is nothing ambiguous in the way he declares his feelings for his ailing son. When he tells his cousin he does not love Martin less than his newborn son and demands to know everything about him, his words still ring with the passion of a father, deeply and insistently attached to his firstborn child. So now we're on got another passage here. It says here, the French historian Fernand Braudel said that war punctuated the 16th century Mediterranean year with its rhythms, opening and closing the gates of time with terrible regularity. It is a good analogy when 16th century Europeans were not fighting other Europeans or invading the Americas, although this was still a very minor part of their military activities. They were fighting the infidel armies of the other great emperor of the time, Suleiman the Magnificent. By 1541, his Ottoman Empire had coiled itself around the Mediterranean like a serpent. It had spread east from the rim of Austria, across the Balkans to Greece and Turkey, down to Palestine, to Egypt, and west across North Africa to Iran, in present-day Algeria. It had almost encircled Spain. Spaniards had long endured a sense of vulnerable geography, for slavery in North America was a common fate for North Africa was a common fate for coastal dwellers and seafarers captured by corsairs from across the Strait of Gibraltar. Cervantes himself, the soon-to-be creator of Don Quixote, would one day be a slave in Algiers. But since the fall of Granada in 1492, Christian Spaniards had also come to fear the enemy within they had created when they forced Islamic Spaniards to convert to Christianity. They now suspected these hapless converts of collaborating with the enemy across the straits in North Africa. In 1535, Carlos V had captured the city of Tunis. In 1541, he turned his attention to Algiers. His imperial fleet of German, Italian, and Spanish galleys began gathering at the island of Mallorca. In October, this vast armed flotilla sailed due south to North Africa. Hernan Cortés was among the Spaniards who embarked on this great adventure, and Martin Cortés, who was now 19, sailed with him as well. Malinche's son had been raised among the nobility of Spain, but he had no wealth or land to call his own. The soldier's life was the only honorable path for him to follow. As a child initiate of the Order of Santiago, he had vowed to fight the infidel. Now, as a young man, the opportunity to keep that promise as a member of such a noble imperial mission against the eternal Islamic enemy, with his father by his side, must have seemed irresistible. The confusion regarding the brothers called Martin Cortés begins in earnest in contemporary records of the Algerian campaign. Cortés's chaplain and biographer, Francisco López de Gomara, said that Don Luis and Don Martin went with Cortés to Algiers, but he did not say which Don Martin. Bernal Diaz de Castillo said both boys called Martin took part in the expedition, and he was quite specific about this. He said that Cortés took his son, who inherited the estate, as well as Don Martin Cortés, whom he had by Doña Marina. El que jubó que Doña Marina is what it says here. So it says here, let's see here. Now, this is kind of like getting to a somewhat sad part of the story, and you'll see why when I read this passage here. I'm starting to get like, I'm going to need like a breath of fresh air, so I'm at the point now where I'm going to put in the StreamYard link, and if you're someone that I know, I'll let you on, just so you can do like commentary, but yeah, this is like really hard to do on your own. So it says here, I never found any evidence to confirm that this was true. He's talking, and the author's talking about how whether the younger Martin Cortés actually went to Algeria or not with his brother and father. It says the only certainty is that in the spring of 1541, Hernan Cortés, his firstborn son Martin, and his middle son Luis sailed towards Algiers in a fine gallery called Esperanza. Its name meant hope. But the expedition proved a disaster for the Christian forces. Before they could engage in a battle, a tempest smashed their fleet against the jagged coast of North Africa, and Carlos V, the first and last greatest emperor of Europe, who loved war and had never known defeat, learned that failure was possible, even for him, and ordered a general retreat. Hernan Cortés' response to his emperor's decision to withdraw has been retold so many times that it has become one of the famous set pieces of Cortesian history. Both Diaz de Castillo and Lopez de Gomara tell us that Cortés was so appalled by the idea of retreat that he came forward and offered to take Algiers with the remaining forces. To him, the tempest and the shipwrecks were merely a temporary setback, a strategic problem to be solved. He was an aging soldier. However, and few people knew who he, and it says here, and few people knew who he was or what he had achieved in Mexico. They're talking about Hernan Cortés. His bold proposal came to nothing, and Bernal Diaz de Castillo said that Cortés lamented out loud that he did not have under his command the soldiers who had taken the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan with him 20 years ago. They were men, he said, who could suffer hunger and ordeals and storms or whatever came their way, and still perform heroic deeds. There were men whose injuries never prevented them from fighting on and capturing fortresses and pyramids and cities. Cortés may have said all of this, and news of his speech may well have reached the ears of Diaz de Castillo, who was by then on his way to a new life in Guatemala. But the words he places in Cortés's mouth may also reflect his own old conquistador's disdain for a younger generation of men who could be forced into retreat by a mere storm. They are words he must have longed to believe his former commander had uttered, loudly and with dignity, in the hearing of Doña Marina's child on the rocky coast of North Africa. And how did this 19-year-old Martín Cortés experience this travesty of an invasion as he fought for his life in the waters of the Mediterranean? It was not an auspicious beginning to his career as a warrior, but he had survived while 12,000 other men had not. Was he proud of his father's courage? Did he feel angry or embarrassed by the fact that Cortés was now a forgotten man, his own father? Or did he believe in him when no one else did? Whatever he felt, he, his father, and at least one of his brothers found a place on one of the remaining vessels, and by November 1541, they had returned to the safety of Spanish waters. So now we're on the next section here that I have titled, well, it's no title to it, you'll just hear it. It was told to me during the years that followed disasters at Algiers, Malinche's son had lived the dangerous, restless life of a European warrior in the forces of the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a life spent in the battle or in readiness for battle, a life not very different from the one he might have lived in Mexico had he been born before the conquest, instead of 1 year after it. Except that in Mexico, he would have fought with weapons made of obsidian rather than Toledo steel. He would have worn armor made of quilted cotton rather than metal. And if he proved exceptionally courageous, a jaguar skin around his shoulders or eagle feathers on his head, rather than the red sword cross of Santiago on his breast. Hernan Cortés did not return to Mexico after Algiers. He stayed on in Spain and tried again and again to win an audience with Carlos V, but the emperor ignored him. Cortés's predicament had later inspired Voltaire to tell his own famous story about those last forgotten years. Voltaire said that one day the old conquistador pushed through the crowds around the emperor's carriage and mounted the steps. But Carlos did not recognize him and asked who he was. At this, Cortés replied, sadly, "One who has given you more kingdoms than you had towns before." And it says here, in 1843, when the great blind American scholar William Prescott wrote his famous conquest of Mexico for the English-speaking public, he thought this was an apocryphal story. Prescott was probably correct, yet Voltaire's tale captures something of the way of the conqueror of Mexico had truly been forgotten in his own country. After 6 years lingering around the royal court of Spain, Hernan Cortés finally understood that the emperor would never receive him, and that his grievances against the crown would never be resolved. He set out for the south to find a ship to carry him back to Mexico, but in Seville he was overcome by acute stomach pains and dysentery. He must have known that he was dying because he called the notary to the house where he was staying and gave the man instructions for his will. In the beautiful 16th century reading room of the Archivo General de Indias, I explored the 58 complex causes of Cortés's last will and testament with their patrician blend of benevolence and tyranny. Cortés had left strict instructions for the transfer of his bones to Mexico, and their reburial in the same tomb as those of his dead children. He had instructed that 50 poor men should be given woolen capes and tunics and a gold coin each, and asked to carry lighted torches in his funeral procession. He named as many servants and left them various sums of money and orders that they should be given food and lodging, and the wages owed to them. To the younger female servants, he left dowries to help them marry. He ordered hospitals, a monastery, a theological college to be built in Mexico City at the expense of his own estate. He left, and I think it's something important to emphasize here, the fact that, like, this is the sort of things Hernan Cortés wants to leave behind as his legacy. And not in Spain, but in Mexico, specifically. Actually, before I even continue, I think this might be Noel. Let me see. Rizombo Freshness, what's up, dude?
Greetings.
Greetings. How are you?
Yeah, man, it's great that you're doing this. That's an interesting person to learn about. That it's technically he's not the first mestizo, but it's where you get kind of a look into really how maybe the first mestizo was treated, especially the son of Cortés. It's just very interesting to learn about that.
Yeah, I agree completely. And yeah, he obviously wasn't like the first literal mestizo. I mean, obviously, that was probably like some Caribbean person, if I had to take a wild guess. I mean, I'm almost positive it would be.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's very interesting, like what you had just mentioned, where Cortés was wanted to leave more of a legacy in Mexico. It kind of shows really the significance that he even himself saw it as a very significant achievement of the conquest of the Aztecs, where he saw himself more as he, I guess how I would say he conquered the Aztecs in the name of Spain to a certain extent, but he, in a way, he didn't just shrug it off and say, "Oh, I conquered it, and there it goes there." No, he wanted to focus on leaving his footprint in Mexico, which is very interesting.
Yeah, no, Zambo, real quickly, I just want to say, keep talking. I'm going to use the bathroom like real quickly. I'm going to let you fill in the empty space, but I'll be back in like 30 seconds here.
Yeah. But yeah, guys, it's been great listening to this guy. We have a guy who says, as a self-hating mulatto, Chivo. Oh, God. So what you guys in the chat?
All right, I'm back. Sorry, keep talking if I interrupted.
Yeah. Yeah, basically what I was mentioning is I actually, you did mention that he did know how to actually speak the native language as well.
Who are we talking about?
Martín Cortés?
No. He knows how to speak Latin and Spanish. He has no idea how to speak Nahuatl.
Oh, okay. That was my confusion then. Yeah.
Speaking of which, are there any confusions you've had internally since I've started that maybe I can try to fix before we keep going on? Because sometimes I need people to like be like, "Yo, what's going on here?" In certain areas.
No. I guess if you could elaborate more on, you were speaking of the sickness that he had.
What about it?
Like, what exactly? How was it? You had mentioned that there was a view of that sickness. Like, Cortés seemed to be pretty upset about it.
Well, yeah, he was upset because like the only people that had like a specific way of like formally, I guess, curing it were, I believe, like people I think that were in like other parts of a different empire that he didn't really have access to, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
mean, his son survived and everything, and I mean, who knows if the king doing a weird ritual on you was actually going to cure you anyway? That's what I would say. I mean, you never know. But yeah, let me keep reading here. But yeah, dude, thanks for coming on. You've been a lifesaver. This like will drain you when it's just yourself. So yeah, it says here he left handsome sums of money to his wife, Doña Juana, and their three daughters back in Mexico. But he warned that if any of the daughters should marry against the wishes of their mother or their brother, his successor, they would forfeit their entire inheritance. He left a generous sum to his daughter, Catalina Pizarro, the girl who had been legitimized with Martin and Luis in 1529, and to the mestiza daughter called Leonor, whom Isabel Moctezuma had borne him in 1527. How had Malinche's son fared in his father's will? 8 years earlier, Cortés had. Let me just make sure I have this. Actually, no, we don't even need to read all that much. The will is a very convoluted thing that kind of gets brought up later, and basically, the other Martin Cortés really pisses off Hernan, and we're not really sure why. But Hernan gets really upset and essentially just says like, none of you are getting the shit that you were promised now because he ruined it for everyone. And this is the other Hernan that is not mestizo. He's just Spanish, if that makes sense. Any thoughts on that Zambo freshness before we move on to the next passage here?
Is there any idea of how, maybe why, or what may have pissed him off?
There's only speculation, but like she really couldn't find like anything definitive to really nail it down.
Yeah.
So there's another thing. We're getting close here to like the actual death of Hernan Cortés, right? He's getting old. You know, we all die. That's life. But something that I found that's interesting is she actually visited the home that he died in. And I'll read it here. It says, a young novice opened a door. I explained why I had come, and she invited me inside. We walked together down a shining corridor bordered with the pretty tiles one sees everywhere in Andalusia. And as we walked, she explained that the building had been the house of a judge when Cortés came here to die. It had later become a ducal palace and later again a refuge for Irish priests fleeing English persecution until eventually it was evolved into a convent school it is today. And that's all I really wanted to say about that. I just thought it was cool that the home he died in was, you know, a place to help Irish Catholics, you know, later on from the British.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we have one last passage in this chapter here. And it's kind of talking about like how by the summer of 1562, Martin traveled back to Mexico in order to transport his father's bones there. So it says, Martin Cortés had traveled down the watery highway between those orange and olive trees and beards of garnet to a ship waiting at the river mouth to carry him back to Mexico. He did not go alone. His younger brother, the Marqués, and his disinherited brother, Luis. Actually, I was wrong. It was Luis that I think pissed off Hernan, not the other one who she calls Marqués. But moving on, it says, they carried their father's bones with them. The time had come to bury them in Mexico in accordance with his last wishes. How did Malinche's son feel as the wind filled the sails of his ship, as he heard the vessel's timbers and its hemper lines straining, and it moved out into the Atlantic? Was he eager to return to his place of birth, or did he go as a reluctant member of his brother's crew? Was he apprehensive about the voyage ahead? 20 years earlier, he had survived the shipwreck off Algiers, and as a soldier in the Imperial Army, he must have endured sea travel across the Mediterranean during his forays to Germany and Piedmont and Lombardy. But the journey to Mexico would be an ocean voyage of at least a month's duration. And this time he was leaving the old world, which was the only world he knew, to return to the new world, which he probably didn't really remember. Any thoughts on that, Zambo, before the next passage?
Nope, nope, it's all clear.
Awesome. So, yeah, now we're back to the point where Martin is actually in Mexico, and it gets a lot more easier to actually decipher the two Martin Cortezes apart at this point. It was a lot harder when she's going through archives in Spain. So one of the first things that's interesting is Martin almost died trying to transport his dad's body's grave to Mexico, right? So it says here, he said they and their servants had been almost dead with hunger and thirst when they arrived, for their ship's stores had been lost during the journey. It had been a terrible voyage. Their ship had been blown as far south as present-day Colombia, had struggled back north towards Mexico, and were making the Gulf port of Veracruz when another storm engulfed them, destroying their sails and one of their masts and making it impossible to continue their journey. And yeah, I mean, he survives, obviously, because, the body of Hernan Cortés exists in Mexico to this day. But, like, yeah, this guy almost just, like, got wrecked all the way to Colombia and, like, almost died with his father, just, and all those remains there. On the topic of Hernan Cortés's gravesite, I'm not sure if most of you guys know this or not, but it's like a very secretive. I mean, you can find it if you Google it, right? But like, it was very secretive for a long time where his actual body was, mainly because a lot of Catholic priests in secret in Mexico, they had to quietly hide Hernan's body because they were scared that the Mexican revolutionaries were going to desecrate Hernan's body. Which is like super fucked up, but I mean, these revolutionaries did some fucked up things.
So when you speak about the Mexican revolutionaries, are you speaking about when they were breaking off from Spain, or are you speaking about that age when Mexico was going through during like the early 1900s?
Oh, with like their socialist stuff?
Oh yeah, okay, I get it.
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I mean, I don't know much about the Revolution of Mexico, and there's like a million different like storylines you have to like know about as well, or narratives about that. About about all the revolutions, honestly, since it broke off from Spain, there's just constant revolutions. Really weird esoteric situations would come up in Mexico, but I mean, I don't know these in detail.
Yeah, because you had mentioned that they were afraid that these Mexican revolutionaries were going to desecrate his grave. I mean, when I usually think about an era of like revolutionaries, I think about the early 1900s, the Cristero Wars. So it's very interesting, like which type of revolutionaries. But yeah, it's something, I guess.
Yeah. So I got another passage here. We're going to read it until this is done. Okay. So it says several thousand Spanish residents lived within the straight, wide streets and graceful plazas of the post-conquest city. Free and enslaved Africans lived and worked beside them, but the Aztec survivors of the siege of 1521 lived outside the Spanish sector. Theirs was not an apartheid-style exclusion forced on them by their conquistadors by any means. It was a separation they preferred as they struggled to retain their traditional social structure and survive the epidemics now sweeping their city. In the 40 years since their city fell to the Spaniards, its Amerindian residents had been devastated by the disease they called Huayazacuatl, or the Great Sickness, with its disfiguring pustules and its burning fevers, as well as by the other European ills they had never before encountered, like chickenpox, measles, and influenza. In 1563, when Martin Cortés arrived, they were only 50 years away from the moment at which they might have ceased to exist altogether if their emergent immunological resilience had not suddenly begun to pull them back from the brink of extinction. But nothing was simple in the post-conquest city. It was not a bipolar world in which only two possibilities, white or copper skin, existed. Nor was it divided purely along racial lines, for class seems to have often prevailed over race as a social marker. Within the Spanish Quarter, alongside the most respected members of Spanish society, lived a privileged indigenous elite that included the Moctezuma family and other nobles. They still spoke their refined and eloquent Nahuatl, but they also now acquired Spanish and Latin. They maintained the old exclusivity from Aztec commodores they had demanded before the conquest, and they held to the pre-conquest sumptuary laws that had permitted them, and them alone, to dress in rich and elaborate garments. Except that now, they added Spanish garments to their costume and married their sons and daughters to the sons and daughters of the Spanish viceroy and his aristocratic relatives, rather than to fellow members of the Aztec nobility. What was Martin Cortés's place in this complex phoenix of a city? And as the son of the Amerindian concubine of its Spanish conqueror, he was technically a man of mixed race, a mestizo. But as a privileged child educated at the royal court of Spain and the brother of the second Marqués de Valle, he belonged to the highest echelons of vice-regal society. Any shame that might have been associated with his illegitimate birth seems to have been assuaged by his illustrious family name. If his racial identity mattered to those around him, their concerns are not explicit in the documents surviving from the time. I saw him referred to as the natural son of Hernan Cortés, but never as the mestizo son. His racial identity didn't seem to matter, or else he would have been incorporated, or it says here, or else he had been so incorporated and so fully into the world of Spain, in his dress, his manners, his demeanor, his disposition, that it went unnoticed. I began to sense that the first mestizo might not have been regarded as a mestizo in his own time, that his symbolic identity was apparent in retrospect than in his own time. And yeah, this is sort of like the thing, and she goes into it more and more, that like basically there's no internal writings of Martin really talking about specifically being a mestizo. Like, it's
Well,
interesting.
that is very interesting because it kind of shows how this what we look at as the first mestizo, the way he acts is obviously more Spanish. And so he blends in very well into Spanish society, and it just kind of it forecasts what the future mestizo is in general. It's somebody who is seen as the balance between the Indio and the Spaniard. Um, and one interesting thing that was very interesting that you had mentioned was about the kind of like they had like a indigenous quarter within Mexico, the city. But you also had mentioned that there were even indigenous nobles that were living within the Spanish city, and how they had kind of still kept that structure that they had before the Cortés had came, before the colonists.
Yeah, and I find it interesting too. There's no really mention of people talking about caste systems or him being mestizo and not pure blooded. Like, these aren't things that are talked about at all.
Yeah. Well, it seems to give us a good indication of how it would look later on in the empire, where um, kind of like the union between the Spaniard and the native woman would be kind of a bit romanticized, and uh, it, it really kind of demonstrates that, right? Because if let's say it would have had the opposite effect, where everybody was saying, "Oh, you're not a real Spaniard, you're illegitimate," and all this, then that would have given us a good indication of how the future looked like. But in reality, that like you had mentioned, that's not the case. It seems to be that they fully accepted him into Spanish society. They respected him, um, and it seems to show, really, it forecasts the future of how people are viewed when it came to the unions between a Spaniard and a indigenous woman.
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of exemplifies using actual relevant examples and not abstract, like, laws, of showing like how people actually dealt with things like race early on. And it's interesting, right? Because like Martin Cortés was like at a royal academy for elite Spaniards, and he's the only mestizo there. I do think it'd be interesting if he ever had any thoughts. Because here's the thing, right? I assume like these aren't politically correct people. I'm sure they've definitely referenced his appearance growing up in Spain. Like he probably was aware on some level, like he's a mestizo. Like I've been to Spain. I probably had more uh, European blood than Martin Cortés. I didn't feel like I blended in there visually, and I'm guessing Martin probably didn't either. But I do think Noel is probably right. They might have just assumed he was an especially swarthy, like maybe Canary Island person. It's not like they'd never seen brown people in Spain or anything, but
Well, I guess there we're just kind of just speculating because we don't
right.
really know. I mean, I guess from my point of view, maybe it would have been seen like, oh, but it would have been not something paid attention to. There wasn't this in Spain. There wasn't this phobia of like, oh, he has indigenous blood or something like that. There wasn't this phobia, especially from what I find among a lot of the conquistadors, like in Cortés, they showed respect to the natives. They saw the natives as people that were, needed to be civilized, of course, but they saw the natives as respectable people. They didn't see them as.
Well, they had tribes that they liked and disliked, but I
Oh
know
yeah,
what you mean, though. I mean, generally speaking, like with the more advanced Indians that joined the Spanish crown during the conquest, like, yeah, they had a lot of open respect. You can read Castillo talking about it in his own writings for them.
of course. So I don't see. It makes sense why the Spanish didn't have that view, and as well, but a lot of it had to do with the Catholic doctrine. That had a big influence. The Catholic worldview. Um, Although that does come, I think, maybe later on or so. I don't know that where the Pope declares that the natives. I know there at some point there was this big debate where, okay, are the natives human or are they not human? Because they had came across them and they didn't know. And the Pope had said, yeah, they have as such as a soul, just like any other European does. Um, so it seems to me like from what we were getting from this book and from what you were reading, he was very well respected. Um, and it seems to be like his status as a mestizo didn't stop him at all. I mean, it had no effect on him.
I agree. And let me just continue. I'm going to read this passage here. This is the passage I was talking about earlier, where she compares the treatment of Indians to Australian Aborigines, right? So it says the indigenous communities of Coicayan, Cuernavaca, Chapultec, Tabuca, or Tacuba, Zimaltan, Ocolatan, Huastepec, and Amilpas had all brought actions against the Marquess or Hernan's, the other Martin Cortés. It says in Spanish and Nahuatl, sometimes in iconographic form on the traditional Amato paper they had used for centuries, they had complained that he and his father, Hernan Cortés, had exacted excessive tribute from them. The communities had demanded compensation for the lands, the temples and palaces they had lost during the conquest, and many of them had wonder cases, either wholly or in part. I found it strangely disquieting that mourning in the archives to see that indigenous Mexicans in the 16th century had used the Spanish legal system so effectively against their Spanish conquerors. Where I come from, Australia, indigenous people seeking to recover their lands through the courts are told more often than not, even now, that the tide of history has washed their claims away. Entry after entry in the index revealed that the Marquess had been plagued by litigation from within his family as well as from without. And then let's see here. But yeah, I mean, I thought that was interesting. The fact that like she's an Anglo, she went through the archives, definitely with her own bias, and she's like, I have to come to this conclusion that I have to come to the conclusion that these people like were able to actually challenge their conquerors in court and like actually get their land back. And that
Yeah.
no one else really did that. Like that wasn't a fucking thing in the New World
This
outside of that.
this reminds me that there's like this meme of the British we had done tons of these tricks to African kings and the even the Australian Aboriginals, where they would give them these treaties, and yeah, they would sign it, but literally the treaty was saying, "You're giving me all your fucking land," and it just reminds me of that. And
Or
that's
they would just
actually,
not honor treaties. They would just do that a lot too.
well, yeah, of course, but the British had their tricks where they would give a treaty and just to see it legal from their point of view, even though they know it was, it wasn't. So that's very impressive. I did not know that the natives were able to use the Spanish legal system. They were like their own lawyers, and that's very interesting. I never knew that.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, these historians in the Anglo world, they want to infantilize these Indians and treat them like they're helpless victims when that's not what they were. These were highly complex people. And these weren't like, super jungle Indians from like maybe like Choco, Colombia. These were very sophisticated Aztec and Mayans who, and other tribes obviously too, that and other language groups that knew what they were doing, that had already their own languages, that had their own writings and their own very advanced like infrastructure and everything else. They weren't like mouth drooling idiots.
Yeah, absolutely.
I noticed I even saw like memes in the past where people would claim the Indians didn't know what wheels were or hadn't invented it, but it's like Aztecs literally had toys that had wheels on them.
Yeah, well, I believe I've heard that before. Yeah, that the natives didn't have a wheel. It seems like maybe there may have not been much of a need for a wheel. Like they didn't really need it.
Well, they didn't have like horses or
Well, yeah, they didn't have
anything
horses.
to the equivalent of that, a giant animal that moves things around with wheels. So, I mean, you had the Incas with like llamas, but like that was like the closest thing you had in this entire Western hemisphere, like llamas.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some people bring that up, and they're like, "Oh, they never had the wheel." Well, yeah, maybe they just have didn't really know how to use one, like how they would use it, or they weren't urgent in needing one. I mean, if you really look at their society and how advanced they were in mathematics and astronomy, I don't see why they would have never been able to invent the wheel in the first place.
It's just like people that don't know what they're talking about. But I'm going to read this next passage here, which I think is a little interesting tidbit. It says here, I knew enough about Luis de Quesada to know how much he and Martin Cortés might have come to know each other. Quesada was a member of the aristocratic Mendoza family. He sometimes called himself Luis Lopez de Menoca in an allusion to that connection. He had married Maria Exarmido in 1542 when she was 16, and in 1555, according to his own probanza, or proof of service to the crown, he had accompanied the Prince Felipe to England for his marriage to Mary Tudor. That, I suspected, was when he encountered his brother-in-law, Martin Cortés, for the first time. I'd often wondered whether Malinche's children had been aware of each other's existence. I thought I might never know for certain. Yet Martin Cortés's power of attorney revealed that they had known about each other, and were in contact for at least 6 years before he returned to Mexico. The far-reaching powers he had granted to his sister's husband suggested that a deep sense of trust had existed between them. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting, the fact that, like, we knew that Malinche remarried, had kids with another Spaniard after Hernan, but like people didn't know for a while, and it's often like, they didn't know whether these people were aware of each other, but they were, and they were close. So I think that's good.
Yep.
And then let's see here. So now we're getting to the dark turn in Martin Cortés's life, for both of them, to be quite honest, but especially so for the Mestizo. This is where he's going to start feeling some serious trials, even compared to the ones prior, because initially he was fighting, Muslims in right? He was fighting Muslims in, I guess, like the Mediterranean world, and
North
now
Africa. Yep.
now he's going to have to go up against basically the Spanish Empire, and you'll see why. He's basically being accused of rebellion. And remember, I don't know if you were listening since the beginning, but in the beginning, I talked about how tensions were starting to flare between Hernan Cortés and the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, because he didn't want to make Cortés a viceroy of, New Spain, despite the fact like he was the literal conqueror. And then this is where things start to get worse, because we get in a situation now where a lot of the children of conquistadors are now being heavily, I guess, targeted by, I guess, the Spanish court system, because they're hearing rumors that these people essentially want to make, they want to crown themselves and make themselves like, make their own kingdom essentially, and like they weren't about that. Now, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to argue in both ways that like Martin, maybe he did know, maybe he didn't, but that's beside the point. He's going to be challenged quite a bit here. So it says here, in Mexico, the second viceroy had enacted the new laws prohibiting slavery with greater caution than his counterpart in Peru, who had been murdered by Spanish settlers for his trouble. But when the viceroy of Mexico did enact them, he incurred the bitter wrath of the conquistador class, who could now no longer profit from the unpaid labor of their Indian captives. Those who could afford to turned instead to African slavery. But by the time Martin Cortés returned to Mexico, that too was being questioned. In 1560, the Archbishop of Mexico City had written to Felipe II, saying that he could not see why Africans should be made captives any more than Indians. May it please our Lord, he had implored the king, that this enslavement cease. Soon after, word came of yet another proclamation from the king. Felipe had confirmed his dead father's ruling that lands won in the Americas could not be held in perpetuity by their conquerors, but must revert to the crown after the second generation. This is why the exasperated conquistador sons of Mexico City rejoiced at the turn of the Marquess, because they saw Hernan's son as a natural leader in their battle against the crown, determined to limit their wealth and power. They welcomed him as if he were a prince returning to claim his throne, and in a way that is precisely what Martin's other brother, Martin Cortés, was, for at 30 he possessed both riches and enormous prestige in the viceroyalty. But his admirers had forgotten that he was already blessed with the perpetual inheritance rights for which they longed, and that his prosperity and that of his descendants was guaranteed for centuries to come. If they had not been so blinded by his famous name, his noble title, and his wealth, they might have realized that although he enjoyed their adulation, he had no real stake in their battle with the crown. If they had, the bloodshed to come and the ordeal of Martin Cortés might have been avoided, but it wasn't. And then this would be a huge problem for Martin. Okay. Any questions before I go into the specific thing that's going to lead to actual arrest now?
No, yep, you can continue.
Awesome. So it says here, in March that year, a rich and fashionable young man named Alonso de Avila organized a masquerade to celebrate the birth of the twins to the Marquess and his wife. So this is, again, for everybody, so everybody understands, Marquess is Hernan, or not Hernan, Martin Cortés, but the one who's not a mestizo. Juan Soares de Peralta said that Avila was a favorite of the Marquess and one of the most splendid knights in Mexico City. Era de los más lucidos caballeros que había en Mexico. Suarez de Peralta praised Avila's charming manners, his elegant clothes, his complexion, quote unquote, as fair as a lady's, end quote. Alonso de Avila's masquerade was a reenactment of the conquest 40 years earlier, in which his father had taken part at Hernan Cortés's side. Avila led a procession of his friends and servants into the plaza. All of them were dressed as Aztecs, and he appeared as Moctezuma, although later he changed into his father's old conquistador armor and assumed the role of Cortés. They rode into the plaza and up to the Marquess's house. When the Marquess and his wife appeared in the grand doorway, Avila's Aztecs presented them with bouquets and coronets of roses. Suchiles, they called them, for they had adopted the Nahuatl word Ixoquitl for flower. I can't read these words. I'm learning Spanish. I don't have time to learn Nahuatl as well. According to later testimony, someone called to the Marquesa telling her to take the crown she was offered. Another witness would remember that among the paper messages offered to the Marquesa with a floral crown was a little rhyme telling him not to fear the fall, for he would rise to greater heights. No temas la caída, it advised him, pues es para mayor subida. Later that evening, during the banquet that followed, Alonso de Avila knelt before the Marquess and presented him with a set of jugs and drinking vessels inscribed with a crown, and beneath each crown the letter R for Rey, or the king. There is something slightly mad and deeply portentous about Alonso de Avila's masquerade. It took place at the height of that long period of provocative conduct on the part of the Marquez, and in the perilous context of recent conquistador rebellions in Peru and Nicaragua. The masquerade became a disaster for all who took part in it, for soon after, perhaps that same evening or early the following day, one of the guests left the mansion where the Marquess and his friends had been celebrating, walked a short distance across the plaza to the royal houses, and told the authorities what he had seen. The judges of the royal council listened to what he said and were convinced that a conspiracy against the crown, led by Marqués de Valle and his brothers, was afoot in Mexico City. And this is where things get really, really bad for Martin. So initially, he is, just to sum up some things here, he is arrested formally, and then he's brought forth to a judge, and he's questioned. So it says here, let me see. He's basically questioned by a judge. I can read the entire, summary transcript if you want, but I mean, basically he's just saying that he's innocent. He's not a part of any conspiracy. So I mean, I don't think it's that important to actually read in full here, but eventually the Avila brothers, they are prosecuted in the worst possible way. They are summarily executed. So it says here, when Alonso de Avila saw his brother's head fall to the scaffold, he looked shocked, as if he had not believed until this moment that he would really have to die. He fell to his knees in fright. Suarez de Peralta recalled, and whispering the penitent's prayer, Miserere me, Deus, have mercy on me, Lord, in thy kindness, he began fumbling with the cords of his collar. It was his duty to lay his neck bare for the executioner, but suddenly he stopped and gazed towards his mansion across the plaza and cried out, "Oh, my children, oh, my dearest wife, to think I should leave you in this way." Suarez de Peralta said there were murmurs in the crowd, for in this ritual of death, a man like Avila was expected to die courageously, not whimpering in fear. The priest reminded Avila that this was not the time for such a lament, and he should look to his soul in the hope that it would fly directly to the Lord. "And I promise you," the priest told him, "that tomorrow I will say a mass for you." He asked the men and women watching to commend Avila's soul to God and urge him to declare that his execution was just and proper, as was correct as such moments. The watchers below the scaffold understood their part in this ceremony and did as they were asked. They began praying aloud for Avila and called on him to make his confession. The priest turned and spoke gently to him, saying, "That is the way, is it not, senor?" He was prompting him, of course, in the etiquette of public death, for, in spite of Avila's fine manners, he had probably never thought to prepare himself for such an end. After several minutes of anguished silence, Avila agreed that it was the way, and falling to his knees again, he began to pray. Once Suarez de Peralta said it was obvious to all who watched that Avila feared death terribly. He stammered out his confession, admitting his guilt, but refusing to incriminate others. And when he finished, he lowered the collar of his shirt. The executioner stepped behind him and tied a blindfold around his eyes. And Avila, confused, reached out and touched it with that trembling white hand of his. He whispered something to the priest at his side, something Suarez de Peralta could not hear. Then at last he laid his head on the block and prepared to die. The executioner had to hack 3 times at his neck before he managed to sever it correctly, and at each blow the crowd cried out in disapproval. Suarez de Peralta said that As they left the plaza, everyone felt distressed and confused about what had happened, and no one could make out whether the Avila brothers were or were not guilty. And yeah, I'm not even going to speculate on that, but I wouldn't be shocked if they were guilty. And I respect, as Rancho is saying here in the comments, he didn't snitch. Damn straight. So now Martin Cortés, fast forward a little bit more, the Mestizo, he is being tortured horribly. It says here, Gavaleta said that when Martin Cortés responded, it was to say that he had already spoken the truth and had no more to say. The torturers were Juan Navarro, I don't know why I pronounced it like that, and Pedro Vaca. It seems strange that their names should have survived all this time. The judges ordered them to strip Martin Cortés's clothes from him. And they did as they were told. January in Mexico City is icy, and he must have shuddered from the cold, and perhaps also from fear and humiliation, as he stood naked in the chamber before the judges in their elaborate robes. The two men tied his hands together with a rope, and the judges asked him again to tell him what they knew, or to tell them what he knew. He replied that he had already told the truth and he had no more to say, as God was his witness. The men threw him onto the rack, jerked his arms back above his head, and fixed the rope around his wrist to the end of the apparatus. They tied more ropes around the muscles of his thighs and to his ankles and to his toes, and pulled those ropes through the holes at the other end of the rack. They then began twisting and tightening them, using garrotes to increase their leverage. Gavaleta's careful and precise transcript cannot convey the sound as Martin Cortés's bones were dislocated, as ropes burned and sliced into his limbs and toes, as groans and cries escaped him. It tells us only that the judges again demanded he tell them the truth about what he knew. I have spoken the truth, he replied. I have nothing more to say. The torturers turned the garrots again and tightened further the ropes attached to his limbs. Martin Cortés may have cried out. Gavaleta does not tell us, but he remained resolute in his answers. I have spoken the truth, he said. I have no more to say. The judges now ordered the question of water to be added to his ordeal. One of the torturers forced his head back lower than his body and held his nostrils to prevent him from breathing through them. The other pushed a horn into his mouth to hold it open. Then he began pouring a half quart of water down his throat as slowly as he could. Probably not even Martin Cortés could have described the drowning horror he endured as they poured and poured, or the shock of relief when they released his nostrils and extracted the horn from his throat. The judges asked him again to say and declare the truth of what he knew. How long did he cough and gasp before responding? Could he speak or did he whisper? The scribe notes only that after some time he managed to reply, telling them again that he had spoken the truth and had nothing more to say. From this point on, a terrible monotony invaded Gavaleta's transcript. And then, by the order of the judges, he wrote, a half quart of water was poured into his throat, and he was told to declare the truth about what he knew. After each pouring, each near drowning, the men extracted the horn from Martin Cortés's throat, and the judges ordered him to speak. His voice may have sounded different as he stammered and whispered and panted his replies, but Gavaleta said his meaning did not change. I have spoken the truth, he gasped. I have no more to say. They forced his head back and thrust the horn into his throat. And then by the order of the judges, a half quart of water was poured into his throat. And Martin Cortés only had to respond with, I have spoken the truth, he said. Then they forced his head back and thrust it back into his throat. It says, and then by the order of the judges, a half quart of water was poured into his throat. I have spoken the truth, Martin Cortés gasped. But this time there was a desperate edge to his words. And by the holy name of God, I will say no more, even if you kill me. They forced his head back and thrust the horn into his throat. And then by order of the judges, a half quart of water was poured back into his throat. I have spoken the truth, Martin Cortés managed to reply, and I know nothing more. They forced his head back and thrust the horn back in. And he does another, I know nothing, I have only spoken the truth, Martin whispered, and I have nothing more to say. Suddenly it stopped. Cavaletta recorded that after the sixth jug of water had been poured into Martin's throat, he was so ill, so weak and exhausted that the judges decided to suspend the torture for the moment and resume when the prisoner had recovered sufficiently to endure more torture. I took this to mean he could no longer speak, was perhaps barely conscious. I could have read these transcripts in less than 30 minutes if I had not felt so agitated, but how long did he endure his multiple chokings and dislocations, his rope burns and cuts, the bitter cold, and his naked helplessness? His ordeal might have lasted 2 hours, even more, for the judges wanted to induce him to speak rather than kill him. It says he did not record at the time when the torture began, but when he signed his transcript at the end, he noted it was then 9 hours before midday, that is 3 o'clock in the morning, January 8th, 1568. So yeah, he doesn't get killed or anything, at least by these guys. He actually survives this.
Oh, that is very painful to hear, man. That honestly makes me pretty sad to hear that.
It reminds me of cartel shit, to be quite honest.
I guess. I don't know. I felt like I've seen this type of incident before, sometime in history, where somebody really truly is innocent and they're just getting tortured, and they have nothing to say. It reminds me of like kind of like, you know, one thing that kind of comes to mind is he could have told them what they wanted to hear, you know, but he didn't.
I think you like get tortured worse when they find out though that you lied.
Yeah, that's the thing as well. Like, you're just gonna get tortured worse. But that is very painful to hear. Like, honestly, somebody like him to be going through that. Yeah, that's. But there's much to admire from him, and the way that he kept, you know, he kept being honest. He kept to the truth, and he held on to his dignity, and yeah, it's very interesting.
To be fair though, it's entirely possible that they were planning to actually like do this. I don't think it's fair to say that he was innocent definitively, but
yeah,
it's still honorable again that he didn't snitch. Like, they definitely wanted him to.
yeah.
So yeah, eventually Martin, you know, after he's kind of like they leave him, you know, they stop torturing him, and he can still like reside, you know, in what was formerly Tecnoticlan. It basically, the author comes to the conclusion after doing archival evidence that Malinche's son probably actually did go out and, you know, he went to a formal exile. So it says here, did Malinche's child sail in that forlorn ship of exiles? It seems likely that he did. If so, he was driven from his father's city precisely 40 years after he left it to begin his childhood journey to the royal court of Spain. His last recorded statement was his bleak acknowledgement from the shadows of the dungeon on the 10th of January, 1568, that he had learned a sentence of exile passed against him. That and the last words he had uttered under torture 2 days later were, "I have told the truth. I have nothing more to say." So yeah, he basically like flees. He's got to leave Mexico at this point. And yeah, he eventually dies in Europe, like fighting battles for the Holy Roman Empire again. And they're not sure like the exact circumstances of his death, obviously, but we'll go over what little is known. But I want to kind of just talk about real quickly these final like passages that I picked out regarding the conclusion of the heirs of Cortés. So it says here, the brothers called Martin Cortés, both of them, the Mestizo and the pure Spaniard, probably never saw each other again after they were separated in 1567. On his return to Spain, Martin's brother with the same name was incarcerated in a castle near Madrid and permitted no visitors. And by the time he was released from prison, Malinche's son was finally dead. The crown confiscated the Marques's great estates in Mexico. It fined him a crippling 50,000 ducats and condemned him to perpetual exile from the Americas. After his release from his castle prison, the Marquess seems to have spent the rest of his days on the fringes of the royal court, living the idle courtier's life his father would have probably disdained. He died in Madrid in August 1589 at the age of 57, and his son Fernando, who was then in his 30s, became the third Marqués de Valle. And it says here, Fernando had been born and raised in Spain, and although Felipe II had restored the Marquesado to him, he never crossed the ocean to Mexico to visit it. When he died, he left no children, so the title passed to the younger brother Pedro, one of the twins whose birth had inspired the ill-fated masquerade in Mexico City in 1566. Pedro Cortés y Ramirez de Eraño was the fourth and last Marqués del Valle. He returned to Mexico in 1604, but died 20 years later without any heirs. Hernan Cortés's legitimate male line had finally died with him, and it only lasted 3 generations. So I find it interesting, like, it only took 3 generations for this man to just run out of heirs. I mean, I'm sure he had a bunch of illegitimate children. You know, Hernan Cortés, he probably, Lord knows how many, but his actual line was just gone after that. What lived on was his actual legacy, what he did in the conquest. And again, I still found it pretty sad that, like, while Hernan Cortés is in, like, fighting for the Holy Roman Emperor in Europe, like, they don't even really treat him with respect anymore. Like, they've forgotten about him. Like, imagine how shitty that must feel. Like, you conquered Mexico, and like now they're like, you know, they're not showing you this respect that you obviously have earned.
Okay, so basically, Martin Cortez has been the victim of basically, oh, now that you did this, okay, now you're trash. Now we're gonna shit on you, and now please die. Basically,
Not like die, but it's like it's time for you to go in exile. Like, we're not going to formally kill you, but like you need to like leave and go somewhere where you're not going to be a problem.
so fucking gay.
Well, I mean, this is ultimately the sad curse that occurred to a lot of conquistadors. It's like a lot of those children of the conquistadors, they had all of their shit taken from them from people from the Holy Roman Empire instead. And, you know, they were worried that the children of the conquistadors were just going to make their own kingdom. And I don't even know if I would have opposed, you know, the children of conquistadors creating like an actual monarchy in Mexico City. That actually doesn't sound like a horrible idea to me.
I would have. You know, you
And
gotta protect the crown of Spain.
I mean, I wouldn't know to be honest, but I mean, I wouldn't like do all this dirty shit that he went through. Like, I would just, you know, go through it the diplomatic way. Like, hey, what are you gonna do with this land? You gotta make sure you wanna do this right. Like, but no, these people literally do shady shit and ruin his legacy, like just like that, and throw him in the trash, like real gay.
You know, I feel
Real
like
shit.
this is during a time where I would guess maybe they're getting a bit. They're trying to really make sure they hold on to what they've conquered, to what they have, and they very likely had that fear from the beginning that these conquistadors could have separated themselves and founded a kingdom, but and this seems to have continued on with the children of the conquistadors as well, since you know people like even Martin Cortés were, you know, very well respected and people really liked them.
Yeah, and like Hernan's quote unquote white son, he was still treated like shit too. Like, this isn't something you can just nail down to like discrimination because he looked different than other people in Spain, because that's not what happened here. But I want to read this here. It says Martin Cortés probably did not live to see that terrible exodus of 1570. According to his son, he died the previous year. Fernando Cortés did not say where, probably because he never knew, but he believed his father had been fighting with Don Juan's forces when he was killed. Don Juan's field of operations during the 1569 was the Almanzora Valley, so it seems that is where Malinche's son, the first Mestizo, died and where his bones were scattered, in that beautiful eastern corner of Andalusia, in a valley high above the Mediterranean, closer to Africa than to Mexico. Yeah, that's some real shit.
It's a bit of a real shame that he wasn't able to die in really what we would really call his homeland, probably where he would have wanted to be. He died on, at least he died fighting, right? But that just kind of shows that it's pretty cruel what the what was done to him.
What I love though is the fact that like history has been rewritten in such a way that like you're told to hate the conquistadors when I actually feel like they're the least people you'd want to hate out of like all the officials of the Spanish Empire that existed. In fact, I would argue they were probably the most badass out of most of the officials that existed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just hearing about recently I was actually watching a documentary of Cortez's conquest uh, of Mexico City, what is today modern day Mexico City, and it seems to have been that he had been disobedient to, I think, the governor of Cuba. Well, I don't know if it was Cuba during that time, but he had been disobedient to a governor in the Caribbean, and he basically, some of his troops were getting discouraged and they were trying to leave, and instead what he did was that he completely destroyed the boats so they wouldn't leave.
Yeah, he did do that, which I mean, yeah, they were already engaging in too many potential mutinies, and he felt like he had to do that. But that's ballsy, man.
I mean, you see these guys. I mean, let's be honest. Like, it takes brave men to go into a place that nobody has ever been to, surrounded by people that you're not going to expect to see you very friendly. And to go there and not know what's going to happen. Maybe you might die, maybe you might succeed or fail. It takes bravery and it takes wisdom, and that's something you can respect out of the conquistadors is wisdom. Cortés had wisdom. The conquistadors that conquered the Inca Empire had wisdom. And I absolutely do stand by your statement in that even though in today's world a lot of them are made to look like villains, like people that were greedy.
And just in a generalized way, I mean, obviously there were like bad Spaniards that were conquistadors, but like it's like they want you to believe this whole thing was evil. They were all evil, and it was all just like this very cartoonish situation that, and it's like the Anglo-Saxons that are fucking, spreading this propaganda on top of that over like the bones of the dead Indians of North America too.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about them is that they applied their experience of colonialism and they apply it to basically every other empire that has been born.
It's
they do the
projection.
same thing to the Spanish Empire.
It's projection. It's Anglo projection. Ultimately, it's They every historical empire ever, the British just they did it like we did, and they just like completely overshadow their legacy over them and just create a bunch of bullshit legends on other empires that they're enemies of.
Right. Because like what's funny is like they didn't do a black legend on Portugal, even though like, if anyone probably had a similar like civilizational ethnogenesis to the Spanish Empire, you'd have to say it's the Portuguese to a certain extent, even if there were obvious differences too, though, that have to be emphasized. But that's the way it is. But I actually want to read one final passage, which I thought was interesting near the end. So basically, the author of the book, she's trying to find any living descendants of basically, the Cortés family, right? And it says here, I watched a hummingbird flutter against the bougainvillea. It says, draw in its quote of honey. It says, okay, so she meets a guy called Don Francisco, right? That's who she's looking for. It says, how can I help you? Don Francisco asked me. I told him I had come because I was investigating the life of Martin Cortés. I had heard that he, Don Francisco, might be a descendant of Don Martin and wondered if this was true. He sipped some water and replaced his glass on the table. As far as I know, his blood doesn't flow through my veins, he said after some minutes. But, however, there is a relationship between us. He paused for a moment. You know the Church of La Santissima? He asked. I told him I had visited it that morning. He says, I don't know if what I'm going to tell you now is true. But the story goes that not long after the conquest, the Indians began plotting a rebellion, and one day they attacked the church. They tore it down, smashed it to pieces, and everything inside it, the cross, the statues, the candlesticks. Then they fled to the hills behind the temple. He looked out into the garden, then at me. Martin Cortés sent his men after them. They dragged them back to Tepoztlan and herded them into the plaza. It was night. The villagers had no way of escape. He announced that he would now put every one of them to the sword, every man and every woman who had taken part of the desecration. But he would spare their children. That was his one act of mercy. He would let their children live, but from now on they must bear his name. I'm descended from one of those children, he said to me. That, as I understand it, is how I came to bear my name. I had listened in silence. I'm sorry to tell you this, he said gently. It's probably not what you wanted to hear. It's not, I replied, but I have to hear it. And yeah, that's basically it. She's kind of like a little doing her white woman. I'm distraught that this mestizo, slaughtered a bunch of Indians that desecrated a Catholic, church. But I mean, what do you expect? The conquistadors didn't fuck around with this sort of shit. Like there were certain ways in which they would punish people, the Indians, and yeah, desecrating a church, that'll definitely get you killed. I mean, no one's going to deny that massacres like that didn't take place in the Spanish Empire. It did.
Well, I imagine later on most of these massacres are probably done by mestizos themselves. So I don't. That's actually a very interesting story that guy was saying. I mean, it seems to have been that Martin Cortés has spared the children, and maybe, I don't know, may be true. He even says himself, it may be true, it may not be true. But if it is true, that is really cool. So.
Then there's final speculation, and I don't need to read it, that like this might have also been his brother too. Like we don't know. We're not like, even if we accept the story is true, it potentially could have been his brother who was not a mestizo. But I'm reading this comment here. It says here, I'm going to do that to feminists in Chile soon if they elect me. Well, it's like, that's the thing, right? I mean, these guys, and it's like, that's why I can't really hate them. It's like, these conquistadors would have never let feminists destroy a Catholic church. Now they do it all the time in Latin America, and nobody says anything. Nobody stands up to them. They just let it happen. And it's like the old conquistador stock would have never, ever, ever tolerated such thing. They weren't into post-modernity. They weren't into this idea of like, oh, like, maybe the Indians and their religion could be just like as true as ours. And you didn't have cultural relativism. Like you can't operate an empire like that.
That's
not one.
Because I had recently heard your interview with E. Michael Jones, and E. Michael Jones was very clear in mentioning that Spain took Catholicism very, very seriously.
Even for the time, they were unusually religious, the conquistadors.
Yeah. You're saying that conquistadors weren't usually religious? Or?
No, they were unusually religious for their time.
Oh, they're very religious. Oh,
like, even like other normal people in Spain, like, were like, wow, like these guys are really devoted.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. Yes, but yeah, I mean, just elaborate on it. Spain definitely took things very serious. I don't know how true the claim is. There's a claim that even during the times of the Enlightenment, Spain would ban certain books or certain literature within the colonies. I don't know if you know anything about that. It was mainly to kind of protect the Catholic worldview, or to.
I mean, I know for certain, like, you couldn't have, unless you were like an actual clergy member, like you weren't going to read and have access to like Islamic and Jewish texts, or else the Inquisition would go after you because they'd suspect you're a new Christian up to no good. And actually, while we're on this topic, I want to bring this up real quickly, because a lot of people have this idea that during and after the Reconquista, this idea of limpia de la sangre, or like, clean blood, and I guess discrimination against new Christians, that it was like this inherently like racial thing. It wasn't, and I'll explain why. Wikipedia of all places actually has a good entry on this that like explains why people that claim it was like very racial probably aren't interpreting it correctly. And what I mean by that is this was a situation where like it was more religious than anything else. And what they meant by this was that they had suspicion that people that were, that became newly Christian, that used to be Moors or used to be Jews, that because they were so, I guess, used to practicing Islam and Judaism for, generation upon generation, that even unknowingly they might be engaging in heresies and such, and spreading it to other people, which was why they were very suspicious when it came to like clergy member, trying to pick people that they believed were not new Christians. Although this created another problem down the road where people would try to fudge and make up like fake genealogical records in order to not be viewed suspiciously by other people. And it was a lot easier back then to fake your genealogy, as you can imagine. Any comments on this by you guys, or anything about the book?
I guess to get on that topic, that's a very interesting. I haven't looked too much into that. I know that, of course, we learn about in 1492 the decree that the Spanish crown had made, where especially to Jews, if you convert, if you don't convert, you need to leave, and if not, if you're going to say you have to convert. I do remember E. Michael Jones speaking a bit about this, and he had mentioned that you had basically these crypto Jews, and a lot of them even fled to the Americas. And they were still practicing their faith in secret. They still, and actually,
there was actually a conquistador that got in trouble for they discovered that he was one. I forget his name, but yeah, there were some cryptos that were even conquistadors too.
Yeah, absolutely. And he did mention something though, which I didn't know. He said that's some of the most fervent leaders of the Inquisition were
converts.
They were converts themselves, which is, I guess that's something that not everybody hears when they hear a lot of these over exaggerations of, the Inquisition.
I agree completely. And I want to actually just answer Rancho's questions, and maybe anyone else that has questions in the comments section. Yes, Martin, the son of Malinche, did have children. Specifically, he was married to Doña Bernalida de Porras, and they had two children. I think one was Ana Cortés, and then the other was Fernando, who I referenced earlier. We don't really know much about them at all, though. We don't even really know when Martin died. We know he died in Spain. He might have died 1595, but we're not entirely sure. Like, you got to remember, the 1500s, the record keeping just isn't what it used to be. And yeah, you had this happen. But yeah, he had two kids, but Cortez's entire legitimate line got wiped out in 3 generations. And that's back when people would have kids like crazy. So yeah, any questions here from the audience here, or else I'll just wrap it up if there's nothing else anyone wants to talk about. Let's see. Jose Martin or someone else? Oh, you're talking about the I believe the Cuban independence guy. I don't know what you really are asking me about him. I'm not a huge expert. I think he died like falling off his horse. I know that. I think Alvarado died getting ran over by a horse too in Guatemala, but I confuse a lot of these people.
I guess if you could elaborate more, you had said, now recently I've been looking a little bit more into this, but it said that there was this belief that, for example, and maybe you know a little bit more about this, but there was this belief that if Spanish blood was seen as being a person of good character. So when you married another Spaniard, you're procreating, and it seems to be like that. Maybe that concept was there for example, when they were marrying the Indians, where they were bringing that good character into them. They were incorporating them into the empire. But it seems to be like.
I'm not sure about that. I just want to make that clear. That's you, but I'm going to let you keep going, though.
No, well, if you could just elaborate more on that, what that had to do, how Catholicism viewed, um, you know, all that, the whole process, like if was there a correlation, or something like that.
So I'm gonna just read a few paragraphs from Wikipedia on this topic that I found earlier today. But then I want to actually do like research into the actual studies that are cited, because that's probably going to give me a lot more information that I'm looking for. But essentially, regarding the Costa system in Spain, and then I think this is going to be a final topic before I kind of like just wrap this up, because I think we should just do, I want to just do a whole episode because there's been entire studies and books about this that are like even legible in English actually too. And like people are to this day still doing very detailed analysis on Mexican archival records and coming to actually more Hispanophilic conclusions than social justice conclusions, which I find interesting here. Like, I'm really
There's
surprised. I'm gonna link it
there's also
here. Hold on, real quick. I'm gonna link it real quick in the YouTube chat. This Wikipedia article on like the Costa system is actually very like unbiased, surprisingly. They actually go out of their way to basically say that like most of what you hear about it, especially from like Wignats and shit and social justice warriors, is completely misunderstood.
I
And
did
these are
read
like
that.
normal historians, that are, a lot of them are even Anglos studying Mexican archives and are coming to these conclusions.
I did read that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say that not just Mexico, but also in Peru, that there's actually an archaeology documentary that I have it on my watch list. That they're basically excavating, search records from really old searches that that they just died, or and they're digging out, and they were doing DNA analysis and many anthropological analysis, and they found out that the same conclusions that they will find in Mexico, that there were mixed people of all racial backgrounds, whether mulattoes, mestizos, whatever Costa term you want to think of, that they were registered in the churches, and they basically died as Spaniards in a way. Yeah, you were gonna say something.
No. I was just waiting for you. I'm gonna read once you're done what I found here, which makes a lot of sense. But we'll go into it like in more
Yeah, but
detail another day.
basically, Peru is also having that same research that they do in Mexico. Like they're excavating, and they're digging into the parochial uh, documents, and they come into the same conclusions. Like, it's very Hispanophilic. It's very white pilling.
Well, and what I really think is cool is like this history is not like a lot of it's like new that's being written as we speak today. Like there's like a lot of people are still basically just emerging from the myths that came out of the independence movements and are now able to look at this in a way less emotional way than before. So let me read some of this. It says here, the degree to which racial category labels had legal and social consequences has been subject to an academic debate since the idea of a caste system was first developed by Angel Rosenblatt and Gonzalo Aguirre in the 1400s. Thanks, Rosenblatt. So it says here, both historians popularized the notion that racial status was a key organizing principle of Spanish colonial rule, became commonplace in the Anglosphere during the mid and late 20th century. However, recent academic studies in Latin America have widely challenged this notion, considering it a flawed and ideologically based reinterpretation of the colonial period. It says Pilar Gonzalebo, in her study La Trampa de las Castas, discards the idea of the existence of a caste system or caste society in New Spain, understood as a social organization based on the race and supported by coercive power. And it says here, Joanne Rappaport, in her book on colonial New Granada, rejects the caste systems as an interpretive framework for that time, discussing both the legitimacy of a model valid for the entire colonial world and the usual association between caste and race. Then we have here Berta Ares' 2015 study on the viceroyalty of Peru notes that the term casta was barely ever used by colonial authorities, which, according to her, cast doubt on the existence of a caste system entirely. By the 18th century, its use was rare and appeared in its plural form castas, characterized by its ambiguous meaning. The word did not specifically refer to sectors of the population who were mixed race, but also included both Spaniards and Indians of lower socioeconomic extraction, often used together with other terms such as plebe, vulgo, naciones, clases, calidades, otras gentes, etc. And it says here a detailed analysis of Mexican archival records published in 2018 were published in 2018, and the professor Ben Vinson came to a similar conclusion. I'm actually going to email Ben. Maybe I can get access to the study here. It's by Cambridge University. And it says here, often called the Sistema de Castas or the Sociedad de Castas, there was in fact no fixed system of classification for individuals, as careful archival research has shown. There was considerable fluidity in society, with the same individuals being identified by different categories simultaneously over time. Individuals self-identified by particular terms, often to shift their status from one category to another to their advantage. For example, both mestizos and Spaniards were exempt from tribute obligations, but were both equally subject to the Inquisition. Indios, on the other hand, paid tribute and were exempt from the Inquisition. In certain cases, a mestizo may try to pass as an Indio to escape the Inquisition. An Indio might try to pass as a mestizo to escape tribute obligations. So I'm not sure if that gives you like a good, like, I guess, little summarization, but I'm surprised Wikipedia is actually like that fair on this matter.
Yeah, I actually, that's actually really good information. I had also read another Wikipedia page which mentions it kind of now analyzes the historical term of mestizo. And it does mention that, I don't know, if you literally just search up and the Wikipedia page mestizo, you can read about, it's not just speaking about the category mestizo, it's also speaking about the rest of the it also refers to Creoles, Mestizos, mulattoes, Africans, Indios, and there's some information on that. But that's a little bit where I don't know if maybe it's something over exaggerated. I don't know if you can search it up right now, but if you there is a quote, it seems to be of somebody from the Catholic authority, where they seem to have declared certain marriages clean and certain other mixes were seen as unclean. And this is something I want to, maybe you may not be very informed on it yourself, but I want to kind of get to the bottom of that and see, if this is true.
Yeah, obviously, and I don't think the truth really fears investigation. I would like to look into this stuff in the future. I agree. But
there's this mention, that the black legend was very over exaggerated, but I don't want to create a white legend. I want to make sure I can see how things truly operated.
What's interesting though is I feel like so far all the evidence is showing, even the Wikipedia article, it brings this up. It's like most of these ideas of like getting very racial, it only became like a thing among like certain like criollos near the end of the empire, not at the beginning. And these guys were definitely being influenced by, liberals of European descent and from Europe just completely, that were getting into things like race science at the time that was foreign, in a pre-Enlightenment world.
It's got to be the Criollos every single time, man. The traitors of the empire, bro.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm a white skin though. It's like these were the worst people of the empire, but yeah, go ahead. Like, let's act like the Indios are the reason why everything went to shit near the end and the independence movements formed. That was entirely the fault of the Indios. Yep. Okay.
Lol. But yeah, I'm really excited for the like. Are you planning to do like a like Costa review on next stream, or you think we can do this right now?
We're not going to be able to do it today, dude. No way. Probably not even anytime in the future, to be quite honest. In the near future, to be honest. I have a few other books I would like to look at before getting deep into the Costa system. What's interesting, though, is the most Black Legendy stuff that exists on the Wikipedia page for the Costa system. It's all one person's book being cited, which I found is interesting.
Is it Bartolomé de las Casas?
No,
Yeah.
he was too late. He was too early for that. It's a guy with a Spanish last name, though. It's not an Anglo. To be fair. I mean, like, it's possible he was Anglophile or grew up in America. I have no idea. I'd have to look into it. But it's like literally one guy that is primarily cited for like all of like the things you hear about the worst aspects of the Costa systems from one guy from one book.
That's the first pygmy, dude. We found the first pygmy. That's the guy.
maybe, but I would like to know, like, maybe if there's any kernels of truth in that book and what they can tell us. I mean, even when you're reading propaganda that's literally meant to like demonize your ancestors, like you can still find bits and pieces that are going to tell you very revealing information if you know how to read in between the lines. So yeah, let's see here. Yep, looks like we got Rancho's theories about potential conversos in the Criollo elites. It wouldn't shock me. I just can't definitively prove it. I mean, maybe, but I want to also believe that, like, Spaniards you can be genetically Spaniard and be a complete piece of shit. I mean, that's entirely possible. And people like Chivo need to understand that, So yeah, I think we're going to wrap it up. I think we're going to call it a show here, unless like we have anything more pressing before we want to go. Anything by anyone on the panel or in the comments section before we leave?
It would have been better to have know even more about the life of Martin Cortés. It would have been his military career is very interesting to me. I really enjoyed this book that you've been reading. I've learned a lot. I did hear before about that. Of course, Cortés had a famous Mestizo son. But to look more into his life, it's something, it's really cool. It's nice.
Yeah, and I think it's better than complaining about Haitians in the Dominican Republic. I like to talk about things that I find more pressing.
What the hell?
Which is, sorry, my internet is annoying. Yeah, I was going to say things that are more pressing, which is like, let's actually learn about like people that were important in, where we came out of. I mean, I'm not Mexican myself, but it's like, Martin did actually himself reach Colombia. Say what you want there. But it's like, this was, the Hernan conquest, the Pizarro conquest of Peru. These were like the civilizational ethnogenesis of, I guess, the Spanish Empire, and you have to, I think it's important to know and honor these people that played important roles and did the right things, and, call out people that were being bad at the same time as well, too. And there were good Indians and there were bad Indians and there were bad Indians or bad Spaniards and good Spaniards,
That it really did shock me when you were reading somewhere in the book that these natives already conquered were continuing to have their traditions. They never left them, and I mean that continues even up to this day in many of these indigenous communities. So
yeah,
I just want to show you
one thing I want to actually, that I think is more pressing, and which is why I don't want to do a Costa episode right away or read about it in super detail, is I've bought some books that specifically goes into the actual Hispanicization, like progress of Indians in like the New World, which I don't think is something a lot of people, including myself, really have a strong grasp of. Like, what does it mean to Hispanicize an Indian? How did that process, start in the 1500s and how did it continue going forward? I think we can learn a lot about our civilization by understanding how they went through that progress, like knowing what the everyday life of an Indio living on an encomienda plantation, who would work for the Spaniard and then, be evangelized to Catholicism. I'd like to know, like what were the details of this sort of stuff, Because I don't think most people in their head have like an idea of like, here's the average day-to-day life of an Indio that is, trying, that is, first being Catholicized and is also being taught like Spanish and stuff as well. And I know the Indios, well, most of them were speaking Indio languages, I think for the most part, until it was the Spanish. I think there were new Spanish laws that outlawed speaking like Indian language straight up in the 1700s, but like most Indians were probably just speaking their language, maybe with some Spanish. And most people just in general during pre-Enlightenment days were not able to read. Even in North America, this wasn't the case. Like most people could speak their language, but like reading, writing, most people weren't doing that. Yeah, I think we're going to end the show here. And that's a good comment by Rancho. No such thing as Colombia, only Nueva Granada.
Let's go. By the way, I was gonna ask you, since you're doing book reviews and you've also uploaded some book reviews on your channel. Do you think you could also do like some PDF uploads to your channel if you can, like so that can people access that literary material on your own channel?
I can. I just have to make sure like what I'm doing is legal, because some of these universities get like super like actually pissed off when you do shit like that. But it's complicated. At the very least, we'll be able to summarize things that are important. And yeah, that's the plan here. I am trying to help recovering pochos that have become white brown people like me. That's the goal. That's the goal here. All right, everybody. Peace out. We're calling it a day here.